Hello, BookTube. Welcome back to Middle Grade Monday. This was created by Storm Reads. Go check out her channel. She's iconic. But we're doing a bit of a sequel video for Middle Grade Monday today because I'm going to be talking about book two in Roald Dahl's autobiography. What's it called? Duology or whatever it is. Last week we talked about Boy and how fun that was. And now we're talking about the second book, the one and the only, Going Solo. So here it is. This was published in 1986, so like what, a handful of years after Boy? Not that long, really. Yeah, and where Boy was about Dahl's childhood, growing up and becoming a young man, Going Solo is very much him being a young adult and working in Africa and then going into World War II. So that's just a quick idea of it, but let's talk about it a bit more because Going Solo picks right up where Boy left off in 1938. Dahl, he starts his voyage to stay in East Africa, and he stays there for like roughly a year. But he tells us all about the eccentric people along the way he meets, and it's just very charming. Dahl again. We'll talk about this a bit more. It's really fun on the voyage. But he ends up in East Africa for working for Shell as an oil distributor. And I think that part's really interesting. Again, it gives you some context. Dahl just absolutely is just an incredible writer when it comes to describing what he does, especially for a middle grade audience. I think it's just incredible. But he meets some native people too. He learns Swahili, I think that's how you say it. But obviously, the most memorable part of the first half of this book is, of course, his encounter with some animals. He, of course, has the snake in his backyard, which is absolutely insane, and that's coming from an Australian. And of course, there's the famous lion scene that I don't want to spoil because you should read this book. But Dahl's writing just absolutely shines in these two moments. They're absolutely incredible, fast-paced, thrilling, everything you expect from a Roald Dahl book. But then World War II begins in 1939, and Roald travels. He leaves Shell first of all, and he travels all the way to Nairobi, and he enlists in the Royal Air Force, and he documents his flight training in Kenya. Again, kind of like his voyage at the start, Dahl introduces us to some very eccentric, funny, mean people along the way. Very, again, classic Dahl. And it's just really interesting to hear him talk about learning to fly. I think it's really cool. Of course, at the end of it, when he gets his flying hours logged and all that, he then travels across Africa to his squad in the Middle East, where the real battles begin. He serves in the Battle of Greece, which is very early on in World War II in the grand scheme of things, against Italy and the Germans. And he serves in that. But in Libya, I think that's how you say it. He misjudges a landing area, and he crashes pretty much. And I think he was solo for this, but he has multiple skull fractures. Oh my god, I can't speak today. He's blind for a bit, but he pulls himself out of the wreckage and is eventually taken to a hospital where he recovers, and then he keeps on serving during the war for like another year or so before the Air Force, sorry, is like, you're no use to us anymore because you're too injured. And of course, Dahl later on would have more back injuries because don't forget, Dahl was a very tall person. That's coming from a tall person, but obviously that plagued him later in life and all that. But and he talks about it quite candidly, but he goes, like, an officer just said, you're no use to us anymore, and they sent him home. So he goes home, I think in 1940 ish, or no, maybe a bit before that. But anyway, he goes home, and the novel ends with him reuniting with his mum, pretty much. And that's really sweet. Of course, Dahl would keep on, be involved in the war too. It's really interesting he chose to end his Going Solo book at that point. I guess because it does have like a happy ending, of him returning home to see his mum and all that stuff. I think that's really sweet. But Dahl did not stay like that for a while. He then, in 1942, traveled to America to work in Washington, D.C. as an intelligence officer and a spy, of course. And of course, he would go on to become a writer and all that stuff. But that's pretty much a quick summary of Going Solo. This is an absolute classic bit of middle grade autobiography, in my opinion. And I think it's better than Boy, just because there's more fine lines going on. There's, I think, some real. Dahl is just talking about some really gruesome stuff in a way. Like the real realism in this book, I think, is just so it's just so well done in a way that is approachable to a middle grade audience. There's a lot of death and grief and just violence in this book, and Dahl doesn't turn an eye to that, and I think that's really interesting. He has such a great eye for detail in this book that makes it really gripping. But also, again, this was in the 80s, so he'd been writing children's books for a long time by now, and he had found his formula pretty much when it came to his writing speed and the pacing of the novels. He was set to go, really. It's literally, I think, just as great as his fiction, even better, to be honest, because you learn more about Dahl. Like, this is what I also love about this book, is that there's just so many fun little personal bits of Dahl in here. There's some snippets of letters. There's photos he took at the time, and it's just a real personal look into Dahl as a person, and I just really like it. I think it really grounds this novel. And it's, again, Dahl's walking such a fine line, but I think he pulls it off incredibly. And yeah, that's your middle grade Monday book for today, Going Solo by Roald Dahl. I'm sure you've read this book growing up. Even I read this as, what, a 10-year-old and absolutely loved it. And it's just an absolute classic and deserves to be, I think, remembered as Dahl's one of his great achievements. And it just shows you how far he really kind of like started, came in his career, because you think of his early stuff when he was trying to be like a poor man's like Hemingway author before he really found his voice. And this is just a great example of that, and also some of his other short stories along the way. But anyway, go read Going Solo. It's absolutely fun. You'll have a blast. It's not that long, and it's just such an interesting read in for one of the greatest children's authors to ever live. So yeah. So thank you so much for watching BookTube, and I will see you next time.